Good evening, bonsoir. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carolyn Quinn, and I'm a volunteer member of Heritage Ottawa's Lecture Series Committee. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches back long before the era that we will be featuring this evening. For hundreds of years, Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples have been pressing for their Indigenous rights to be respected and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa makes efforts through our programs and partnerships to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage with events and programming. I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of our leadership sponsors, Sandy Smallwood and Andrex Holdings, and Merkley Supply Limited, who helped to make our lecture series possible. We are also grateful for grants from the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario. And I'd like to say thank you to our members and donors. Heritage Ottawa is a members-based organization, and we're asking you to consider supporting us by becoming a member or making a donation. Having a membership is really the simplest way of having a measurable impact on heritage conservation in Ottawa, and donations help us offer programming like this lecture for free. And you get to connect with a really agreeable community of like-minded people who are passionate about history and heritage and the quality of the built environment. It's easy. Just visit our website at heritageottawa.org. As you know, in 2026, Ottawa is marking the bicentennial of the city, which has evolved in this place over the last 200 years. Throughout the year, Heritage Ottawa will continue to highlight different aspects of the city's growth, from early Bytown to the present, through the examination of buildings and landscapes. I hope you have been following our weekly bicentennial bites on various social media platforms. Unusually, this month, we are presenting two related lectures as part of our special bicentennial celebrations. There will be a second lecture next Wednesday, a week today, on the 25th of March. We'll tell you more about it after tonight's lecture. At the end of this evening's presentation, our speakers have agreed to respond to questions. Leslie Maitland, architectural historian, author, researcher, planner, and former Heritage Ottawa president, will moderate the questions. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker for the evening. David Gordon is professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning in Queen's University's Department of Geography and Planning. He received his Doctor of Design from Harvard Graduate School of Design. He has taught at a number of universities, including McGill, U of T, Western, University of Australia, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a Fulbright Scholar. He is a member of the National Capital Commission's Design Review Committee, research chair of the Council for Canadian Urbanism, and a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Planners. David's books include Town and Crown, an illustrated history of Canada's capital, Planning 20th Century Capital Cities, and Planning Canadian Communities. David's research focuses on capital cities, waterfronts, and suburbs. He was born in Ottawa, and this is where his family has lived for almost a century. I'm delighted to now turn the floor over to David.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be here. And so many Ottawa friends, um, but not family, on the list today. I'm going to quickly go to our presentation, but I'd like to introduce the wonderful Lauren Breen, who's a graduate student in our school and helped make this presentation. And now we will try to share. So we could have made the title for this how Boozy Bytown almost didn't become Canada's capital because it was a close run thing. And I'm very glad we had such a good land acknowledgement at the beginning because, of course, before Bytown and before Wrights Village, these were Indigenous lands. And this is my favorite website, which I hope you all know, called Native Land, which will tell you that this location was the ancestral home of several First Nations, which we heard earlier. But we're pretty sure that the first settler colonial type who visited the area was Samuel Champlain in 1613. And this is his famous, end of career map that he made after all his exploring of the uh, of the Ottawa Valley and Quebec and Ontario today. And if we zoom in a bit, you can see um, this is Sioux 77 is the falls of the Chaudière. River 91 is the Rideau River, and the river to the north, of course, is the Gatineau. Champlain visited this area in 1613, and although this was long before photography or even good sketching, we have a pretty good idea of what he saw. These are the falls of the Rideau River. We have this good idea of what people saw from the area, courtesy of the amazing military engineers who were surveying. Because not only would they run their survey instruments, but they had a little gadget which they put on top of their tripod, flipped up, had a wire grid they looked through, and some squared paper and a set of watercolors, and they would draw perspectively accurate drawings. And this is the surveyor Thomas Burroughs' um, picture of the Falls of the Rideau in 1826. And we're sure that that's almost exactly what Champlain saw. And Champlain also wrote in his diary about the great kettle of the Chaudière Falls. So this is what the kettle looked like before bridges and development. And these are falls that are 100 feet high. You could see the falls from, they said, 3 leagues down the river. And this is a watercolor perspective sketch by another military engineer, Henry Duvernay, of the original settlement on the north side of the river, Wright's Family Village from 1823. Philemon Wright from Massachusetts were the first white settlers to the area. And they were on the north side of the river and empowered to survey and lay out a town site. And this is, we dug up in the archives the plan of Ruggles Wright, the son, for the expansion of Wrightstown. All the land was owned by the Wright family, and you could lease a lot from them, but not many people did. They preferred to get their own land grants outside of their holdings. Of course, it wasn't just the Wright family and the settlers on the north side. The river was an important method of getting to the west, and the voyageurs were famously using the Ottawa River as a transit corridor uh, to the upper Great Lakes. And this is a wonderful, huge canvas by Frances Hopkins, who was the wife of uh, the Hudson Bay factor. Being taken to York Factory, Frances was a painter, and she would make sketches during the canoe trips, and then spend the winter in a shed making these enormous canvases, which were probably the best record of voyageur trips in the Ottawa River and area. But the area was on the south side of the river was not settled until after the Revolutionary War, and then not even settled until after the War of 1812. And this is the plan for the town of Sherwood, which never happened. This is LeBreton Flats. So this plan was prepared by John LeBreton, a captain who was half pay retired, and he was part of the settlement of the interior, which landed at Richmond Landing here. And the military folks cut a road through to Richmond and then through the woods and then through to Perth. And that's the Richmond Road today, which runs at a funny angle through the grid. And where this Richmond Road touched the Ottawa River was just before the falls. It was a very important place, and the government built a storehouse where you could leave things under lock and key. And Le Breton bought the land around it and the strip of um, forest behind it at auction from somebody who couldn't pay their taxes, and offered to the national government under Lord Dalhousie that he'd sell it to them at 6 times the price he bought it because of its strategic importance. This made Dalhousie really angry. um, and Dalhousie unfriended Captain Le Breton and did everything he could to stop his settlement going forward. So this is Lord Dalhousie, who came in as the Governor General of Canada and was also the military commander. He's a famous general under Wellington in the Napoleonic Wars. And Le Breton's land here, near the Richmond Landing and the falls, um, was the obvious place for the end of a canal. But Dalhousie said they were never going to do that, and he bought the land adjacent from the original grant to the loyalist Fraser. I think it was John Fraser, who had never settled the property. So Dalhousie bought it for a small sum of money and ended up acquiring the lands. This picture is upside down. Um, the north is up here, but he ended up acquiring the lands that include Parliament Hill and Slay Bay. Now, as part of the fallout from the War of 1812, when Upper Canada was almost lost, um, the British decided they needed a supply route that did not run along the St. Lawrence River, where American cannon could interrupt it. So they agreed to build a canal from Kingston up to the Ottawa River, and so that you could go up the canal, down the Ottawa River to Montreal, and supplies could be brought and troops could be brought to Upper Canada to defend it at the time of the next invasion, which was expected at any time. Um, and This was a military engineer named Elliott come up to do a preliminary survey of the site. North up at the top now, there's the little Wrights Village we saw from Duvernay's sketch. Here are the islands and the Chaudière Falls, and Le Breton's is called the Richmond Landing here, and Le Breton Flats were here. And these lands had been bought by Nicholas Sparks, a laborer from Wright's group of settlers. He bought the land just below Dalhousie's purchase for 95 pounds, thinking it would make a farm. And apparently he bought it sight unseen and wept when he first saw the beaver meadow, the swamp, and the small amount of cleared land. But this is the land, Spark Street, of course, that is most of downtown Ottawa today. So we have Dalhousie's purchase here, the Crown lands up here, the Le Breton's lands over here, and Wright's family owning all of the North Shore. And that's the situation when Lieutenant Colonel John By shows up in to start work on the Rideau Canal in 1826. So that's what we're celebrating today and this year with the. Now this sketch from the McCord Museum was made on the first night that they made camp at the foot of Slay Bay. It's attributed to Colonel By. We're not sure if he made it himself. And it shows their canoes as they set up on the edge of the bay, which I'll remind you, that's Slay Bay here. And this is where Dalhousie met Colonel By when he arrived. They visited with and stayed at the Wrights farm. And they agreed that they put the canal up the little creek beside Slay, running from Slay Bay, rather than put it in from and pay Le Breton's price. Dalhousie had bought this land partly because he admired the big bluff of granite here. He thought that would be an ideal place for a fortress. Remember, he's a military general, to protect the north end of the canal. So that land was called Barracks Hill, and today it's, of course, Parliament Hill. So, fast forward, today's lecture is not about the amazing engineering of the UNESCO World Heritage Rideau Canal. This is Slay Bay with the flight of locks beside it, and the one bridge across the canal built by the sappers, called the Sappers Bridge, the Engineers Bridge. And this was the landing spot. There was a road up the side that got you up to the construction camp at the top. And it really was a construction camp. Um, the big city was Kingston at the other end of the canal, where we sit today. Um, and it was never thought of as anything other than a construction camp at first. So this is a layout from 1828, just as construction is starting to peak. Um, there is, again, north is at this end. And you can see it's called Lower Bytown. And there's a bit of land subdivided. There's a very large swamp here and a sewer drain, a surface sewer, which is, York Street and George Street. And there's a small subdivision here on the height of land. This height of land, Barrack Hill, is where the military tents were, and the officers were given lots here to build houses. And the workers either rented a lot here and put up a temporary wooden house, or many of the Irish workers actually burrowed into the side of the clay here and built caves that they lived in. So this land was owned by Sparks. So his farm was a little bit over here, and um, the engineers had built a little bridge here called Sappers Bridge. It's the only way across the canal. And they were looking for a way for construction purposes to get materials over from Wrightstown. So this lots of us have, placemats and prints of this 1826 drawing. It's attributed to Colonel Bye. It looks like a wonderful illustration of wilderness Ottawa, but this is actually an engineering drawing showing where the bridge could go across the islands to the other side. And here's the plan that goes with it. We dug up. So there's a section with all the different bridges, Pooley's Bridge and the Wooden Truss Bridge, and then the masonry bridges built by Mackay here. And the big problem was the span across the front of the Chaudière Falls, which was larger than anything that had been spanned in North America at that point. So the engineers built a rope bridge across it while they tried to figure out how to get something else, a timber truss bridge across it. And this is Lord Dalhousie's wife going across the rope bridge while the other people sort of trembled at the other end. And Lord Dalhousie wrote in his background diary how proud he was that his wife was braver than the colonial staff. So eventually, after it fell down several times and several workers died, they managed to get a wooden truss bridge built across the front of the kettle. And this lasted for a few years. It wasn't maintained well, and it fell down again. And eventually, a very handsome suspension bridge was built by the government of the United Canadas across this. This was a substantial engineering achievement at the time. I think Thomas Kiefer was the engineer. No, Rubridge. Rubridge was the sketch, and I think Thomas Kiefer was the engineer. And here's the remains of Mackay's stone bridge, which are still there. So there's the Chaudière Bridge. which was called the Union Suspension Bridge, because it was the one bridge across the river in the union of the two Canadas. And here's a more romantic view of it from 1845. Now, Bytown itself was, this sketch by Bouchette looks, wow, that looks organized and planned, but it really wasn't. There was, these lots were barely surveyed. You couldn't own property anywhere. It was all owned by the ordinance. So it was all temporary buildings made of green wood, because you could only lease your lot. And in fact, a large chunk of it over here, which was owned by Sparks, and he was eager to sell lots to anybody who would buy them, um, was being held back by the British Board of Ordnance, the engineers. So this is Sparks land back here. This is again, north is at the top. Here's the cliff of Barracks Hill. There are the new locks in the cut made by Mackay's Masons. And this is the plan for Dalhousie's fortress to protect the north end of the canal. Um, and the problem was that Dalhousie had muffed the legislative approval, and he had permission to build canals and civil works, but not to build military works. So he wasn't able to expropriate the land from Sparks, and he just tried to hang on to it. And it went back and forth in the courts and the legislature for a long time because the Board of Ordnance wanted to build forts to protect the ends of the canal. And in fact, after the War of 1812, this was the reconstructed Fort Henry at the other end of the canal, built to essentially the same plan to protect the south end of the canal, and still here. So this was the secret plan for the Barrack Hill Citadel. They couldn't admit that they doing it because they didn't have permission to seize the land, and they tried to get Sparks to give up his land. But now that it was a town, he was determined to subdivide it and sell the lots. And eventually, with friends in the legislature, he was able to do that. Now, 1841, where this sketch was done, they Lord Durham's report had recommended that Upper Canada, Ontario, which was barely settled at all, be connected and enjoined with Lower Canada, which we now know as Quebec, as one colony known as the United Canadas. And its capital was Kingston, which remember that Montreal had a rebellion in 1837, and so had York, or Toronto now. And Kingston had stayed loyal. It was fortified, as you can see here, and it had beaten off the Americans during the War of 1812. So here is, so after that happened and the capital moved to Kingston, the construction of the canal was over, and there wasn't any work in the area for all the mainly Irish immigrants who'd come to work on the canal. All the work that was remained was the traditional work in the forest and the timber trade, where the French Canadians had had almost all the jobs in the woods and on the water for decades. Now, some of the more aggressive Irish immigrants, known as shiners, set about to take these jobs by brute force. This was possible because the Ottawa Valley was on the very frontier of Canadian settlement in 1834. There were no police. There was only a handful of part-time magistrates and some volunteer constables. The nearest courts were in either Montreal or Perth. And most of the troops and the engineers had been withdrawn. Public authority collapsed almost completely in Bytown. The a gang of the Irish gangs were called shiners, and those who opposed them were assaulted or had their houses and businesses burnt. And I'm reading this very carefully because this is all taken from refereed research. And I don't want to be accused of being overly dramatic, but a constable who attempted to arrest a shiner wanted for rape was beaten senseless in the street, surrounded by citizens who were afraid to intervene. And members who were arrested were freed by their mates during the long march down the Richmond Road through the forests to try to get to the court at Perth. So this is the legendary lumberjack Jos Montferrand, Big Joe Mufferaw in English legendary. And this is Montferrand being ambushed by the shiners and beating them off. He was famous for being able to kick the ceiling of the pub he lived in the Outaouais. Um, and he led some of the French Canadian lumberjacks to fight back as the shiners attempted to seize the rafts that of timber that were floating down the Ottawa. One of the gang tricks was to station thugs on the Union Bridge, which was the only bridge across the Ottawa River, or the Sappers Bridge, the only bridge across the canal, and demand a toll or simply rob citizens who refused. This led to the attempted murder on the Sappers Bridge of the newspaper, the only newspaper editor at the time, who'd been opposing the shiners and writing stories about their exploits. Finally, this caused the military who were left to intervene, and the editor's assailants were arrested for attempted murder. An escort of 30 soldiers took the three accused men all the way to Perth to stand trial. So the problem they'd always had where people would get ambushed on the Richmond Road didn't happen this time. So what happened? The shiners regrouped, attacked the Perth jail, sprung the three who escaped into the Quebec woods. I'm not making this up. This is all from the newspaper and the court records. Stories like this were the reason why the lawless Bytown was not selected as the seat of government of the United Canadas in 1841. So he said Montreal and Toronto had hosted rebellions. Kingston had remained loyal to the crown, had a big fort, a navy yard, and the Kingston's first parliament took place. Canada's first parliament was in this building, which I can see out my window from here. It's now Kingston General Hospital and the home of the Queen's Medical School. And the entire civil service of the United Canadas fitted in Summerhill House, this Italianate villa, also now part of the campus. So the first capital of Kingston of the United Canadas was Kingston, and Bytown at the same time looked like this. So this is a plan of the lots. So this is Sparks selling the lots on his land. These are the upper Canadian. This is the upper class, mainly Protestant upper town, and this is the working class, mainly Catholic, Irish, and French lower town. And but it really, this looks like it's almost a planned community, but it wasn't. It was the leftovers of a construction camp. It actually looked like this. This is the first photograph we know of, the oldest one we were able to date for Ottawa. It's Spark Street in Bytown. We think about Kent Street in 1853. We dated it using, this is the new telephone lines, the telegraph lines, excuse me. And here you see the municipal waste removal system and the pigs and the dirt road. And this was the best part of Spark Street. It actually, for a few blocks, had a wooden sidewalk on one side. This is the type of houses these were actually good houses in the area. So that's what Spark Street looked like in 1853. Bytown had no city hall because they couldn't agree where to build it. Nicholas Sparks had an abandoned wooden market building because the the market had moved to the Byward Market. So the Upper Town Market, Sparks gave it as the City Hall. It was made of wood, and this is what it looked like in 1857. Meanwhile, this is the earliest known photograph of Kingston City Hall, which was a very impressive classical stone building set in a stone market square with a big fort out the front of it. This was just an out fort from Fort Henry. The whole town was fortified. Um, Bytown, as a lawless frontier town with mud streets and wooden buildings, wasn't even considered as a possibility for the capital. But Kingston was too English, and most of the population at this point of the United Canadas lived in Lower Canada, and most of the population was French speaking. So after 4 years, the legislature voted to move the seat of government to bilingual Montreal, the colony's largest city, a city that was on the border, the river that separated Upper and Lower Canada. And I believe Montreal would still be the capital of Canada today, except for the very unusual events of 1849. The Rebellion Losses Bill was proclaimed on April 25th, 1949. This was extremely unpopular by the Tory members of the legislature who fought it for years to prevent it from being passed. And the night it was passed, an angry Tory mob left a public meeting on the Champ de Mars, but came down in a torchlight parade and burned the Parliament buildings. The Governor General barely escaped. His carriage was stoned and pelted with rotten eggs. The mace was saved, and one portrait of Queen Victoria was saved by Sanford Fleming and some others. And the mob fought off the firefighters, wouldn't allow them to save the building. The archives and the library and the files of the government were all totally destroyed. Violence continued for another month. The reform politicians' homes were attacked and stoned, and in some cases burned. The lawlessness, in the end, troops were called out. Parliament was prorogued until the fall. The Governor General fled the city, vowing that Montreal had disgraced itself and the capital would never return. So where'd it go? Back to Kingston? No. But in the meantime, while they were trying to figure out and arguing about where it should go, Bytown, member of the Legislative Assembly, and the former mayor, John Scott, who was a reformer, called a public meeting in the Lower Town's Byward Market. This is the best image we have of it from that era. And the meeting was to encourage the Governor General to move the capital to Bytown. However, the mayor at the time, who'd replaced Scott, who was a Tory named Robert Hervey, called a counter meeting in Upper Town, supporting the Montreal Tories. The Montreal Tories had actually not only burned the legislature and drove the legislature and the Governor General out of the city, they were passing a bill and canvassing the colony to join the United States. And believe it or not, the mayor of Ottawa called a counter meeting in Upper Town supporting these Montreal Tories. Both sides were armed with stones and pistols. The Tories came from their meeting in Upper Town across the Sappers Bridge, invaded the meeting at the Byward Market. Fights broke out, and a fusillade of shots was fired into the crowd, leaving 1 dead and 30 wounded, and driving the reformers out of the Byward Market Square. The mayor ordered the arrest of the um, legislative member Scott, the former mayor, and all the reform leaders. Both, and I'm not making this up, folks, both sides withdrew to rearm and returned the next day with muskets, and they'd broken in to the armories of the militia on either side of the river, and they brought cannon. Almost 2,000 armed men converged on Ottawa. But at this point, the remaining military garrison woke up and acted to keep the peace. They stationed 50 riflemen and 2 cannon on the Stappers Bridge, which was the only bridge across the canal, and prevented the Tories from invading the lower town. The two sides fired at each other and fired their guns and cannons into the air to try to intimidate each other, but eventually, staring at the cannon on the bridge, decided to withdraw. So this was all happening in September 1849, and for some reason, the Governor General did not select Bytown as the next seat of government. But can you imagine? God, this is the worst riot in Ottawa's history, and it was over this capital city issue. So the capital went from Montreal to York, or Toronto as it was known now, because it had rebranded from Muddy York to Toronto. And it stayed there for 4 years. Uh, and sorry, for 2 years, but the legislature couldn't agree. They said this is a temporary thing. Toronto was too English, and most of the population was in Quebec. Montreal was out of the question. Bytown was a crazy place. So the legislature voted to move to Ville de Quebec on a temporary basis. And they agreed that they would go back and forth between Quebec and Toronto on a temporary basis until the legislature could decide where the seat of government, the capital of Canada, should be. But they couldn't agree. So when they were in Quebec, um, Upper Canada was slowly filling up with population, and eventually its population exceeded Quebec. And in the lower house, the advocates for the capital being in Upper Canada were starting to prevail. The capital moved back to Toronto in 1855, but everybody at this point agreed that this is ridiculous. But the legislature simply couldn't agree on any location for the capital. Any city that was proposed was voted down by all the others. And if the lower house made a decision on where it should be, the upper house defeated the funding for it. This tied up the legislature for 15 years. Meanwhile, Boozy Bytown followed Toronto's example and rebranded as the City of Ottawa. So in 1855, this was the new City of Ottawa and celebrated with this wonderful new rendering of it, showing Barracks Hill, Upper Town, and Lower Town, the bridge um, across the river, and Hull over here. And doesn't this look charming? Except remember, if you look over here, that's what Spark Street looked like at the same time. But the Union government of John A. Macdonald and Sir George Etienne Cartier was fed up with the debate and came up with a clever plan. Since the legislature couldn't make a decision, let's submit to binding arbitration by Queen Victoria. They got to the legislature to admit to what we would call today a request for proposals for the seat of government, and any city could bid. And they also got the upper house to approve £225,000 to build a parliament building in whichever city was chosen by the Queen. 6 cities bid: Hamilton, Toronto, Kingston, Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec, and submitted in 1857. And the submissions were bundled up and sent to London with a secret memo on the top that had been concocted by Governor General head with the advice of MacDonald. And surprisingly, John A. Macdonald did not support his hometown in Kingston. The Governor General Head sent a confidential memo to London with the 6 proposals recommending Ottawa. Here's what the memo said. The main objection to Ottawa is its wild position and its relative inferiority to all the other cities named. In other words, the mud streets and no services. But this wild position is a fault which every day continues to diminish. The present population may be called 8 or 10,000, not of the best description. This is Boozy, Bytown. In concluding, the memo said, on the whole, therefore, I believe that the least objectionable place is the city of Ottawa. Every city is jealous of every other city except Ottawa, and the second vote of every place, save for Toronto, would be given to Ottawa because none of the other cities figured that this was in any way a challenge to their importance. So there you have it, Ottawa as the least objectionable place, despite its population not of the best description. So the Queen's Choice was announced in the end of 1857, the beginning, January of 1858, after the re-election of MacDonald and Cartier. And there was consternation. The legislature and most of the colony were appalled and tried to block the decision and debated again around in circles and the only thing they could agree on by July of 1958, by a majority, in the opinion of the House, the city of Ottawa ought not to be the permanent seat of government of this province. And this was a motion of confidence in the government. You know, the Queen was the arbitrator, supposedly. So the MacDonald-Cartier government went down, and they resigned and only survived by the infamous double shuffle in July 1858, where the MacDonald-Cartier government resigned, but hey, the Governor General appointed the Cartier-MacDonald government instead. And MacDonald had once again outfoxed them all by getting the funds for the Parliament buildings approved 2 years earlier. So while the legislature was tying itself up in knots about the Queen's Choice, MacDonald held a competition for the design of the Parliament buildings to go on Barracks Hill here, when the rest of Spark Street looked like this. And this is the winning design by Stenton Laver. Well, let's see if I can get this going. Here we go. Which was done, as you just saw, as a flap over top of that rendering. And the competition was completed by 1858. MacDonald put shovels in the ground in 1859. And to stem Canada East's anger at the capital being located in Canada West, Ottawa, it was agreed the seat of government would move one more time to Ville de Quebec and stay there until the new Parliament buildings were completed. There was only one problem. There wasn't enough money to complete the Parliament buildings. And there were wild stories going that, well, the original estimate was way below the cost of construction. Most of the original vote was spent on the foundations alone. The legislature being in Quebec heard wild rumors that all the funds were being diverted to MacDonald's friends and nothing had been built at all. So the government commissioned evidence using that magical new technology, photography, to prove the front walls were out of the ground. And here's one of the beautiful silver gelatin prints by Samuel McLaughlin. But the money had all run out in 1861. All work was stopped while Ville de Quebec offered to build a Parliament building for free if the legislature would only abandon Ottawa and the Queen's Choice and stay in their town. There was a royal commission for 2 years to decide what to do to investigate the scandal. The Deputy Minister of Public Works and 2 lead architects were dismissed for starting work on a building they knew would cost many, many, many times its budget. But the legislature voted to stabilize the walls and cover the roof. They put a relatively small sum, $300,000, to complete them. And then Ottawa got lucky again. While Quebec was scheming to steal the capital, the Atlantic colonies were going through exactly the same debate. All four maritime colonies agreed that a union was sensible, but only if their city was going to be made the capital. Prince Edward Island would not even agree to discuss the issue unless the meeting took place in Charlottetown, which it did in 1864. MacDonald and his bitter rival George Brown heard about the meeting. By now sick of this debate, um, they stocked a steamboat with cases of champagne and a load of Canadian politicians and went from Quebec to Charlottetown to crash the party. They suggested a broader confederation of all 6 British colonies in North America, with each province maintaining its own capital. At the end of the follow-up conference in Quebec in October, MacDonald slipped in one last motion. The seat of government of the federated provinces shall be Ottawa, subject to the royal prerogative. So Ottawa was saved again. And the reason it could be saved was because the uh, all the cities, including all the provinces, including the new province of Quebec and Ontario, got to keep their capital cities. And the Maritimers are going, oh, those fools in Upper Canada, they're building the parliament anyway, we don't have to pay for it. So they all approved at Quebec in 1865 the Ottawa as the capital, sight unseen. Except for the Ottawa delegates, none of them had ever been to Bytown. So MacDonald took them on a steamboat voyage up the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers because there was no railway to Ottawa. Arriving after dark on Halloween, 1864. It was a good thing it was dark because the roads were made of frozen mud. There wasn't a single street light in the city. They were staying in a wooden hotel, and they were hustled out to take a boat tour because Ottawa looked very impressive from the river, and then back to the half-completed center block where they had a banquet and were whisked back to the civilization in Montreal. They voted to complete the Parliament buildings, which were completed in 1866 and only sat once. And then Ottawa got lucky again because it looked like Confederation ratification would fail. Both Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland, in all cases, it was running behind. And in fact, Newfoundland didn't come into 1949 and PEI until the 1880s. But then we got lucky again. The United States Congress helpfully tabled yet another motion that Canada should be annexed in June 1866. And regiments of decommissioned Irish American soldiers from the Civil War attacked across the border in force in New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec in the Fenian Ways. Scared the living daylights out of the Canadians. Public opinion changed. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick voted in favor. Confederation was approved, and the new parliament opened in 1867. We might think that's the end of the story, and Ottawa was the beloved capital after that, after 1867. And the Parliament buildings were indeed beautiful. But that was the only thing that was beautiful about Ottawa. The rest of Ottawa was not inspiring. In truth, it was a lumber town. And it was not just a lumber town, but the most important lumber town in North America. There were 1,000 saws within hearing of Parliament. The Chaudière was dammed, and the islands were covered with sawmills, which took all the trees that were cut down in the Ottawa Valley, sawed it into lumber, and shipped it to the United States and Upper Canada. Here's the dammed Chaudière. These are 3- and 4-story buildings on the edge. This is the 100-foot waterfall that's been hidden ever since. And this is Ottawa as the sawn lumber capital of the world. So after the lumber was sawn, it was stacked up for a year or so outside to dry to make it suitable for construction. And when you have, look at this, this is a 7-story high stack of lumber, and it's this far apart. So guess what happens? Every couple of years it catches fire. And the hull side caught fire that we know of 5 or 6 times. One fire in 1900 was so severe it, burnt down all of downtown Hull for yet another time. But the wall of flame leapt the Chaudière and started to burn downtown Ottawa. And this is a famous photograph looking down Queen Street at the wall of flame at the other end of Queen Street, and people were escaping with their lives and possessions. The wind changed, and Ottawa was saved once again. This is what LeBreton Flats looked like after the 1900 fire, and this is what you saw when you got off the train from Toronto. And the reason they couldn't put the fire, one of the reasons they couldn't put the fires out is there was no water service in Ottawa. You got your water drawn in a barrel in the 1870s. And there weren't reliable roads. This is Spark Street in the 1880s in the height of the downtown with mud up to the axles of the horse cars. And this was the beautiful view you got if you came from Montreal. The railway finally arrived. And this is the steam train chugged up the Rideau Canal to right up to Rideau Street. And this is what you saw on the other side, coal piles, industrial buildings. This was not an attractive city to visit. And in fact, it was way behind all these other cities. Montreal had paved streets in 1622. Ottawa's first paved street was Spark Street in 1895. There was piped water and water pressure in Ottawa in the 1840s, in Kingston even in the 1840s. So Ottawa was lacking paved streets, sewers, water treatment, piped water, sidewalks, gas lights, electric lights, all these things that other cities had. Ottawa didn't have, but it had a lot of sawmills. One thing it did lead in eventually was electric streetcars. So Ottawa under Thomas Ahern was the first of the Canadian cities to develop a streetcar system. But it was still miserable, and the governor generals hated it. Parliament only met for a few weeks a year, and the governor generals and the parliamentaries fled the city immediately afterwards. But this parliamentarian, Lady Aberdeen, you're getting an honorary degree, decided that something had to be done about it and convinced Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who was trying to get votes in Eastern Ontario, that Ottawa should be improved as a capital. And Laurier declared that if he was elected, he would make Ottawa the Washington of the North, and appointed the Ottawa Improvement Commission in 1899 to try and make the city more beautiful. They started work in the early days of the 20th century, and they had a lot of work to do. And by the Second World War, they still had a long way to go. This is wartime Ottawa at Wellington and Lyon Streets. This is what Jacques Grobert saw when Mackenzie King brought him to Ottawa, said, we want a beautiful capital. And this is one of Grobert's photographs and another one of Grobert's photographs. This is Spark Street near Kent after the war in 1948. And the Supreme Court's beautiful, and Parliament Hill is beautiful, and the rest of Ottawa is a declining lumber town. Building a capital that Canada can be proud of might take a century. Mackenzie King was the big push behind that, and this is a story for another night. It's also told in my book, Town and Crown, an illustrated history of Canada's capital. If you want to know how Ottawa was converted from a lumber town to a capital city. And you can see here this QR code. If you scan it, for those of you who've got your phones handy, that'll get you to the University of Ottawa Press, where you can get a copy of Town and Crown at the ridiculously low price of $41.95. So at this point, I'd like to thank Lauren Breen for helping put this presentation together. And I'm going to stop sharing, and we'd be delighted to take questions from the crowd.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gordon and Lauren, for this was a breathtaking presentation. In fact, I'm just going to quote from the comments coming in. Oh, this comment just sums it up. He says, "This presentation is next level. So fascinating." That absolutely is. It was just a stellar performance, and I enjoyed it tremendously. And so I'm looking forward to questions coming in. And linking over to your book, Town and Crown, my question is we can see places where the Crown, the elected politicians of the United Canadas, and then what became Canada, King and MacDonald and Laurier, they try to create a national capital that was worthy of the name. Did you delve into the kinds of personalities or shenanigans going on at the municipal level? Uh, what was the dynamic between the town and the crown when you look at it from the point of view of the personalities involved?
It was hammer and tong for 150 years. The That's why the book was called Town and Crown. We were actually going to call it Town versus Crown. It wasn't until the 21st century that things really calmed down. Um, there are people I'm sure online that can remember, the city of Ottawa fighting with the National Capital Commission, fighting with the region of Ottawa, each of them sequentially blocking what the other wanted to do in Le Breton Flats, and on and on and on. And I was appalled by this when I found out initially, and then I did research around the world for another book. Before I wrote Town and Crown, I worked with a series of other historians looking at capital cities around the world, and it's absolutely normal that the town and the crown would fight. Um, in fact, when you're setting up a federal capital, most of the time the advice you got was don't allow a municipal government because they'll just make trouble. And so, you may remember, a lot of people don't understand that, um, there was no mayor of London other than the Lord Mayor of the tiny square mile until Tony Blair. 1,000 years of London, the national government prevented an elected representation for the entire city. And Jacques Chirac was the first mayor of Paris. The national government saw what the Paris mob could do, and they didn't want it led by an elected politician. And for 1,200 years, Paris was directly controlled by the National Assembly, and Washington D.C. didn't have a vote, didn't have a mayor. It's only recently, in the 1970s, that they got local government. Ottawa, because it had a local government before the national government arrived, the local government was always there, and they were always, for years and years and years, at odds. They go back and forth. When the federal government was spending the equivalent of billions of dollars on infrastructure to make the city more beautiful, Charlotte Whitten was a very good friend of when alternated between being a complete pain in the neck and a very good friend of the National Capital Commission. And But it was not unusual right from the very time of the Board of Ordnance of the British military to the first mayors of Ottawa. They were at each other's throats for over 100 years.
Plus ça change.
Yeah. Well, actually, I disagree. As a historian looking at this, I've never seen such good behavior among the politicians about these issues. It has partly to do with the National Capital Commission stopping trying to design everything in the area, and thinking about what is it that we have to concentrate on. What are the elements that make a capital city? The embassies, the legislature, the memorials, the monuments, the entrance sequence. And we have to take responsibility for that and do that at a world-class level. But we don't have to tell the suburban politicians how to design their shopping centers.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
when the two sides, disengaged a bit, because the NCC planners were the best in Canada and they weren't afraid to let you know it. And that really got up the nose of the people in Gatineau and Ottawa.
We have a couple of questions asking for clarification. What happened to the Union Suspension Bridge? Did it become the Chaudière Bridge?
It wasn't properly maintained, like all other infrastructure that was handed over, and it fell down. And it was replaced by a cheap iron suspension, the green thing that's out there now, which is
Right.
ugly as spit, and I would really like to see removed.
You mentioned the Fenian raids, but was the choice of Ottawa partly strategic? In other words, because it would be better defended against the US instead of all those other cities, which are basically on the frontier, on the border.
Well, that's right. So that was part of the inexpensive defense idea from the British, right, who wanted to withdraw their troops from Canada. So, there's laughable comments from the United States. The New York Times commented on this new capital city, Ottawa, which they said uh, if you start at the North Pole and head south until the glaciers stop, that's where Canada's new capital was, and nobody knew how to get there. So every chapter of Town and Crown has a quote from someone saying how awful Ottawa was and they couldn't get there. Um, it was mocked because of that, but it was also effective from a military point of view. But I would still argue that Montreal would still be the capital because it was back from the border as well, and the wonderful militias and regiments from Quebec had defeated the American invasions in the War of 1812. So the Lower Canadians said we can deal with the Americans.
A question is raised about you make the point that Ottawa got saved various times through circumstances. And each of these times, were there ever circumstances where other cities came forward and said, "Oh, look, Ottawa's just not working. It should be moved."
Quebec was doing that. Remember, the Parliament was going to be in relocated to Ottawa when the Parliament buildings were completed. Well, I believe that had something to do with the legislature stalling on the construction because Quebec was actively trying to get the capital to locate there. It was argued that in the after the Confederation, the that Quebec would be the geographic center of the new country. And MacDonald argued that actually you're not thinking broadly enough. Ottawa is the gateway to the West, and the West is the future of this country. But that was the Western frontier,
Yeah.
the lawless Western frontier.
Here's a very thoughtful question. This questioner asks, I've noticed a lot of trends that are still true of Ottawa today. Ottawa being, quote, the place no one wanted to be, end of quote, and the French and Irish fighting by the river, and the city having fewer services than other municipalities. In your studies, what is the one issue or thing about Ottawa that was true 200 years ago as it is today? And in other words, what is an ongoing theme that you have identified from the past to the present?
The ongoing theme is that the site of the city is absolutely spectacular. The river, the falls, especially if we ever get the Chaudière back again, the Rideau Falls, the Parliament on a great cliff. Um, no other country in the world has a capital with such a spectacular site. And it's our duty today to reinforce that and make it better. So despite the best efforts of 100 years of trying to ruin what the government, when the politicians saw it on that steamboat in 1864, they were absolutely entranced by the beauty of the site. because they didn't spend any time in the town. The, um, and despite 100 years of trying to ruin it, by covering the islands with factories, by making the river an open sewer, by building tall buildings in the wrong place, the site is still spectacular. You're lucky
Uh,
to live there. Mind you, I couldn't get out of Ottawa fast enough as a teenager growing up in Beacon Hill. Yeah. But it's really changed. My students tell me that life in Ottawa is great and lots of them want to live there. And my brother and sister have moved out of suburban Beacon Hill to Centertown and say life on Elgin Street is very urban and wonderful. And I
well,
really enjoy visiting them there.
Professor Gordon will just have to show you the new revived Byward Market.
Yes.
And here's a question. Do you think that Dalhousie should have paid Le Breton's price? In other words, we would have had the canal going from Dow's Lake along Preston Street to the headwaters of the Chaudière, and then you'd have to get over the Chaudière. Do you think that would have been a better option, or what do you think?
Would have been better, especially if you were expecting to extend the canal up the Ottawa River, which was the Georgian Bay Canal recommended in the early 1900s. Um, but Dalhousie, Le Breton wanted, I think, £6,000 for his land, and Dalhousie said, "I never encourage speculation like that." And they spent probably more than £6,000 to build that flight of locks by Thomas Mackay. But and Dalhousie wanted the entranceway to the canal protected by the fort. So I think he and Colonel By were comfortable with the decision. There's correspondence back and forth about it, and Dalhousie was just furious because Le Breton found out about this when Dalhousie was when Richmond, the Duke of Richmond, was touring the Perth colony. That Ottawa was thinking of building a canal, and he used his inside knowledge that officers sitting around a table in an inn in Richmond to acquire the land and then try to extort the government for extra money do that. And that was just utterly appalled the Dalhousie as a member of the gentry and said, we're never going to do this. And furthermore, I'm going to ruin you. And he came close to doing it. The Breton never got a nickel out of his land.
We have one question about the impact of the mills. So there were many, many mills built around the Chaudière and the Gatineau River and so forth. And when you look at that area now, the remnants of those mills have now turned into the focus of some really handsome urban renewal projects. Like Ziti is a lovely project. So, was it a case of the consolidation of all of these mills throughout the 20th century that we ended up basically with the E.B. Eddy complex? Is that what happened?
What happened was the lumber barons um, cut down every tree they could in the Ottawa Valley that you could float down and didn't replant. So they ran out of wood and all went under. The last, A.B. Eddy made matches and other things. And in the end, the sawn lumber trade completely disappeared. And there was still wood pulp coming in the big rafts until I remember them when I was a boy in the 1960s and 70s. And there was a big sulfite pulp mill that was on the site of where the Museum of History is now. And the sulfite pulp mill had a huge pile of logs that was over by the Alexander Bridge, and that caught fire in 1947, I think it was. And it was the last really big fire, courtesy of the woods industry. It was so bad that it damaged twisted the steel in the bridge, and the bridge was out of commission. Anybody who thinks Canada's history is boring isn't reading enough.
Well, I can remember even in the 1970s, Ottawa stank. It
Yeah,
actually stank.
that
The smell of
sulfite
sulfur was just,
that sulfite mill. The wind blows in the wrong direction. You got rotten eggs on Parliament. So
yeah.
there was a lot of, and the wood had to be imported to make pulp there. And so, in the end, it made a great deal of sense to remove it, and even more sense with the beautiful design, the beautiful site planning by Dutoy Alsop Hillier, and the beautiful architecture by Douglas Cardinal made something wonderful there. And in Town and Crown, you can read all about how uh, the landscape architect said, when this hideously ugly mill is removed, there's going to be a great view of Parliament. And that's what Cardinal was instructed to make. There's one last one there. There's a toilet paper factory. I think it's called the Scott factory. That again, pulp has to be brought in, um, and I hope that will disappear someday. I think that would be a great location for the Museum of Technology. So
Well, and it even has the railway tracks, so you could move those
exactly,
big locomotives.
that's exactly what I think about it. It makes no sense the Museum of Technology being in a former bread factory south of Saint Laurent. The
Uh, Moving beyond, we so far we've focused on the core around the Chaudière, around the basin, the river basin. If you move south, the image of Ottawa as a national capital is reinforced by the construction of the museum, what was called originally the Victoria Museum. And then further on, 1886, the Central Experimental Farm was established. So the museum, you can see why the National Museum was in the national capital. But what are your thoughts on why the Central Experimental Farm, like the showpiece of Agriculture Canada, was in the national capital? Was it related to the national capital, or was it driven by science?
It was way out in the countryside when it was established. Nobody is thinking about, in those days, Ottawa was under 50,000 people, Ottawa and Hull. The Central Experimental Farm was out in the countryside in the farmland. Wasn't very good thinking that, Ottawa will always be 50,000 people. And it's completely swallowed now. And of course, all the important agricultural research is being done in many, many other places. And that wonderful collection of farm buildings, I hope stays forever, and some of the landscape around it. But I'll get myself in trouble here by suggesting that I'm not exactly sure why we need an experimental farm in the middle of an urban heat island. I'm not sure what we're trying, what kind of research we're trying to do here. And I kind of suspect that the citizens of Nepean are, advocating for the farm to stay for reasons other than agricultural research.
There's certainly lots of agendas on the go. On the scientific side of things, they've been studying the impact of climate change there for almost 50 years. Before the rest of us heard of climate change, the scientists are already noticing a trend, and especially in agriculture, cheek by jowl with urban areas, which is in fact a fact of life in a lot of parts of the world. So don't get
Yep.
me started on that one,
So
Professor Gordon.
we could have a great debate on this one.
We can, we certainly can.
I think the experimental farm should be in the Greenbelt, or Kemptville, for example, or Winnipeg, or I think there should be many experimental farms for different parts of the country. And if you're going to do an urban one, it doesn't need to be that big. Um,
They're in fact a network of experimental farms across the
exactly.
country. There you go.
So already being the Department of Agriculture saw the problem decades ago and established other farms all over the country, which was the right thing to do.
Here's a question going back to the lumber barons. Did any of them campaign for Bytown slash Ottawa to be the national capital? Was it in their interest to see this happen?
They were mostly interested in their own interest. So Um, they actually interfered with the since they were the largest taxpayers in town, they controlled the municipal government and prevented them from spending money on infrastructure like, say, water pipes for fighting fires. Um, at one point, E.B. Eddy was the mayor of Hull, I think. And at one point, and the big lumber barons were incredibly influential in the local governments in Ottawa. And you got to remember that the legislature and the governor general weren't in Ottawa that often. It was only a few weeks a year. They all lived in the Russell House Hotel, and the governor generals lived in Rideau Hall, but they got out of there as fast as they could to head for the flesh pots of Montreal.
Well, I think we're going to have to wind up the questions there. And if people have other questions, you can send them into Heritage Ottawa and we will forward them. You can send them to info@heritageottawa.org. So, and as we wrap up, I would like to thank you again, Professor Gordon. Thank you, Lauren, for just a fabulous discussion. And the supporting comments in the question stream are really wonderful. As Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, we're hosting 2 lectures this month. The second will take place also online on the 25th of March, when renowned Ottawa architect and commentator Toon Dreesen will look at Ottawa today and perhaps what the city of the future will look like. And if the past is the predictor of the future, we know what we have an idea of what we might see. This event is free and open to all, but please register at the Heritage Ottawa website. Finally, at the beginning of the lecture, we mentioned that Heritage Ottawa lectures are provided free of charge. We encourage you to join Heritage Ottawa if you're not yet a member, and to donate to the organization to help continuing efforts. Information is available on the Heritage Ottawa website. And with that, Professor Gordon and Lauren, I thank you so much for a fabulous evening. And I thank you, everyone, for joining us.